Welcome to everybody to Radical Anthropology Group. I'm Camilla Power. This is the second last of our talks in this autumn term. And we're absolutely delighted after trying to invite her for quite a while to have Sheina Lew-Levy to speak. Sheina's PhD is from Cambridge in psychology. And she's been a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute in evolutionary anthropology. And we're delighted to hear that she's going to be soon moving to Durham. So we're going to have her in this country, which is great. And her work has been especially looking at comparatively hunter-gatherer children's teaching and learning, their play, their contribution to cultural transmission. And this is a whole area of research which Sheina's in the forefront of opening up. So I'm going to hand over to Sheina without any more ado.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thank you everybody for having me. I've been an admirer and a joiner of this group for a long time, so it feels really special to be on this side and to be able to share some of my ideas. So today I'm going to be talking about my research and thoughts on children as agents of culture change, both in hunter-gatherer societies and also beyond them. So I'm going to first outline why cultural learning matters to human evolution, and then I'm going to tell you what I think contemporary hunter-gatherers can and can't tell us about human evolution. And then I'm going to outline some of my research findings on how cultural learning occurs in hunter-gatherer societies. And then finally, I'm going to depart from my empirical research to share with you a theoretical framework I'm developing about children's role in culture change. Okay, so to start right at the beginning here. So my research is grounded in cultural evolutionary theory. We know that unlike other species, humans live in very diverse ecologies, ranging from the Arctic Circle to the Kalahari Desert. And the way we're able to thrive in these ecologies is by acquired culture rather than biological adaptation. So acquired culture includes the instrumental skills that help us find food in our environments, and also the conventional skills that help us cooperate, things like national dress, things like norms of behavior, for example, curtsying in front of the queen. These are all things that help us identify other members of our group and behave in concert. So aspects of human cognition likely also evolved to help humans acquire these instrumental and conventional skills via high fidelity knowledge transmission. So studying how and when individuals learn can shed light on how cultures are maintained and changed over time. Humans learn in a variety of ways, and throughout this talk, I'm going to focus on cultural learning. So by cultural learning, I'm talking about instances of social learning in which intersubjectivity or perspective taking plays a vital role. So cultural learning processes include imitation, instructed learning, also known as teaching, and collaborative learning. And importantly for the present talk, cultural learning is dynamically shaped by children's interaction with their environment at multiple scales. So from a cultural historical scale, things like ecology, subsistence, socialization values, and opportunities for work shape children's personalities, their behaviors, gender differences, and their growing independence. And then from an evolutionary scale, child growth and cognition has been shaped by the opportunities and challenges posed by situations encountered in our shared past. So to understand child development generally and cultural learning specifically, we have to examine these scales and how they interact. So broadly, my research focuses on how evolutionary, cultural, and historical processes shape cultural learning in hunter-gatherer societies. So what communities am I referring to when I talk about hunter-gatherers? Obviously, many talks have focused on hunter-gatherers, so I won't spend too much time on this. It's always good to have a shared definition. So here I'm talking about communities that mostly subsist on wild plants and animals for subsistence. But of course, there are many other features inherent to a hunting and gathering way of life. So these include living in small mobile groups that come together and separate throughout the year. And even though settlements are small, we know from recent work that individuals actually have very large lifetime networks, both in terms of number of people they interact with and in terms of their geographic range. Hunter-gatherer communities tend also to have many values in common, which are unique in comparison both to the post-industrialized West and to other small-scale societies like farmers and pastoralists. So these include egalitarianism in the sense that communities have little inherited status hierarchy and limited hierarchy according to age and gender. These communities also tend to practice cooperative autonomy with strong taboos against coercing others, but an autonomy that feeds into benefiting the group. And so this is in the camps that I've worked in, a very common thing that happens is in the morning, everybody splits apart and goes foraging. But at the end of the day, everybody comes back together and coordinates their work. So this is what I'm referring to when I talk about cooperative autonomy. And then finally, these communities tend to practice widespread sharing of food, but also of goods, of knowledge, and of space. So importantly for this talk, these cultural values are also extended to children. Children are considered autonomous learners, and they have ample opportunity to be close to and learn from other community members, in many cases, irrespective of gender, age, and status. And in the last slide, I focused on what hunter-gatherer communities have in common, but to me, the most fascinating aspect of hunter-gatherer lifeways is their incredible diversity. So hunter-gatherers are diverse in the technologies they use, the regions they live in, their relationship to their neighbors, and their incorporation into the nation state. And many hunter-gatherer communities choose to maintain their hunting and gathering lifeways as a means of resisting state hegemony and market integration. And historically, some communities have even transitioned to and from hunting and gathering economies, reflecting changes in their social landscapes and climates. So the point I want to make here is that while hunting and gathering is our species-defining subsistence strategy, hunters and gatherers today are very much modern people whose choice to hunt and gather is a product of complex historical, political, and ecological forces. And while hunter-gatherer communities are diverse today, recent archaeological and historical research suggests that they were likely more so throughout our evolutionary history. So here, rather than advocating for any specific community being a model of our evolutionary past, I view the systematic comparison of contemporary hunter-gatherers as necessary to understanding the flexible ways in which humans adapt to historical changes and ecological niches. So Melvin Connor's work has gone a long way into qualifying how this variation is expressed in hunter-gatherer childhoods in his most recent instance in 9 hunter-gatherer societies. And he finds that hunter-gatherers tend to be similar in their high indulgence of children, high rates of physical contact with mothers and others, on-demand breastfeeding, child-led weaning, and the primacy of the multi-age mixed gender playgroup. But he also notes variation in self-provisioning, in chore assignment, and also some other aspects of socialization. So systematic comparisons are really needed here to understand what causes this variation. And these cross-cultural comparisons, as you may have, as I have hinted to, have been kind of the main focus of my work. So specifically, I've worked with BaYaka and Hadza foragers. So BaYaka live in the dense rainforest of the Congo Basin, and they rely on a wide variety of foraging, including fruits, tubers, fishing, and they also hunt with spears, guns, and traps. And they also maintain small horticultural gardens. And I've had the immense privilege of working with BaYaka families over 14 months in the last 4 years, and I look forward to working with them for many, many more years to come. And I have also worked with Hadza, I've lost my mouse here, with Hadza who inhabit the arid savanna woodlands of Tanzania. And these communities rely on honey collecting, bow and arrow hunting, berries, tubers, and fruit. And increasingly, they also rely on maize given to them by NGOs and missionaries, and they also purchase for themselves as from cash they get from trading and from working with tourists. So many Hadza are now settled in villages. A small group of Hadza still live in bush camps. Even in bush camps, they eat a lot of maize, and those are the communities I have worked with. And so in these communities, I have primarily conducted structured behavioral observations, following children around in the forest and seeing what they're up to. And the age group that I work with are children ranging in age from 3 to 18. And then I've also done structured and unstructured interviews, participant observation, as well as experiments to try and understand some of these developmental trajectories. And then finally, I've also conducted systematic literature reviews and secondary data analyses with my research group, Forager Child Studies, So Forager Child Studies was founded in 2016 by a group of orphan hunter-gatherer researchers at Cambridge, who were all studying hunter-gatherers in different departments and had nobody else to talk to. So we came together and we started writing these reviews. And so the goal of our research group is to understand the past, presence, and futures, plural, of hunter-gatherer children's lives with a particular emphasis on learning. And to do that, we bring together researchers from diverse fields. I think right now we have an educational psychologist, we have developmental psychologists, we have mathematicians, cultural anthropologists, evolutionary anthropologists, and I want to say, and we have some data scientists and archaeologists, of course. So we try to collect one of each. So if I have not named your discipline and you study hunter-gatherer childhoods, please reach out and join our ranks. We would love to have you. And so I'll be drawing on some of this data, especially in the second half of my talk. So I'm going to start here by telling you about a time allocation study I conducted on how Hadza and BaYaka children and adolescents learn through play. So since play is intrinsically motivated, and since children's play emulates adult activities, researchers have argued that play may be part of an evolved learning psychology through which children are motivated to participate in relevant aspects of subsistence and culture. And developmental studies of play, primarily conducted in the post-industrialized West, have found consistent gender differences in the types of play children engage in. And I wanted to see if these gender differences held true in hunter-gatherer societies. And Hadza and BaYaka make a really good comparison here, because while both communities similarly value child autonomy, Hadza have a much more pronounced gender division of labor. So Hadza women do almost all of the gathering, and men do almost, 99.9% of the hunting. And in my interviews with Hadza women, none of them told me that they hunted. And once I jokingly made a joke to a girl saying, "Oh, I really want a bow." And she looked at me like I was crazy. She's like, "Bows aren't for us. What are you talking about?" Amongst the BaYaka, on the other hand, men participate in many aspects of gathering, and most women I've interviewed have told me that they know how to and have actively participated in hunting. Usually it's either their husbands or their dads that teach them, and this includes really costly hunting, including gun hunting. So lots of women in my sample have told me they know how to do that, even if they don't do it very frequently. And BaYaka men are also considered by some anthropologists as the most active fathers in the world because they play a very prominent role in child caretaking. So I wanted to see if this was reflected in the types of play I watch children do. And so it was. So the most common type of play I saw in both communities was pretense play, and this made up 30 to 40% of children's playtime. And so here I want to show you what this looks like. So I saw these boys behind my house. They were hunting grasshoppers with these large spears, and they were making this noise. So I called them over, and hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Oh. So I'll just play it one more time here. Okay, so now I want to show you, for reference, this is my friend showing me how you call a blue duiker when you're out spear hunting. So as you can see, even though the children are only pretending to spear hunt, they're actually practicing many of the skills necessary to becoming good spear hunters when they grow up. And they practice all kinds of skills, right? They're making these small spears. They're actually telling each other how to hunt, which is really emulative of how adults hunt. And I should say that they don't have a lot of opportunities to watch spear hunting, especially. So I think they get a lot of this from stories and from opportunistically running into animals when they're out foraging for other things with their dads or uncles. So we found that this type of pretense play, work theme pretense play, which emulates adult work, made up 75% of all the pretense play we observed. And this was true in both societies. So this really supports the view that pretense play helps children practice adult work. We also found some strong gender differences in the types of pretense play children engage in. So this is the data for the Hadza. And as you can see, Hadza girls allocate much more time to playing house, playing foraging, and doll play than Hadza boys. And Hadza boys, on the other hand, allocated much more time to playing hunting than Hadza girls. And now we're looking at the same data for BaYaka, and here you can see that BaYaka girls allocated much more time to playing house than boys, and they also allocated much more time to play hunting and play honey collecting than girls. So I want to point out two interesting things here. The first is that there were more gender differences in the pretense play of Hadza, reflecting a stronger gender division of labor in this community. And second, unlike a majority of the world's cultures, we found no strong gender differences in doll play amongst the BaYaka. Girls did play with dolls more, but it wasn't a strong difference statistically. And this again reflects adult roles, with BaYaka boys emulating their father's more active participation in child caretaking. So what we're seeing here is that children are imitating gender-specific behavior, but this gender-specific behavior is most importantly culturally specific. So to return to this bioecological perspective, we can see that at the developmental scale, pretense play contributes to skill development. And then at the cultural history scale, community-specific gender roles shape what children emulate in their pretense play. And then finally, at an evolutionary scale, that plays likely part of an evolved cultural learning psychology through which children are self-motivated to learn adult skills. Next, I want to tell you a little bit about peer teaching. This was again a time allocation study looking at Hadza and BaYaka adolescents. So here I define teaching as a teacher modifying their behavior to enhance learning in another individual. And teaching is costly. It requires a coordination between both the teacher and the learner. But teaching is also beneficial because a teacher calls attention to relevant stimuli, helping the learner avoid mistakes and leading to more accurate knowledge transmission. So as a result, teaching may have evolved to facilitate the transmission of the very complex and opaque knowledge in which humans rely. So researchers have tended to focus on adult teaching because we presume that adults know more, and also because this reflects the norm in many of the societies where the developmental psychologists come from. So societies where there's Western school, where an adult is the teacher and the children are the learners, and where there are single family households where there might not be a lot of other children to engage with throughout the day. But we know from developmental psychology that children may make very good teachers. So we know, for example, that children's ability to teach increases with their theory of mind. By 1 year of age, children can identify identify that somebody else doesn't know something, and they'll point to fill that knowledge gap. And by 9 to 10 years, children can actually adjust their teaching based on what they think that their pupil knows. So children can be effective teachers from a very young age. Children are also within each other's zone of proximal development, so they can actually scaffold each other's learning in some cases better than adults, because adults have forgotten all the steps it takes to learn something, and they also don't have the same adjustments that they have to do for specific skills. So kids have to do things in their own way, and other children are better teachers of that way. And then finally, peer learning might be part of a multi-stage learning model where children learn basic skills from accessible models like peers first, and they get to practice those skills with peers. And then as they're older, and they've reached baseline competencies, then they actually update their knowledge from experts who are really, really skilled at those tasks. So it's a kind of division of labor of learning. And in this study, I coded behaviors as teaching based on previous ethological studies, so studies that took an evolutionary and cross-species approach. And these included things like instruction, like you would expect in a classroom, but also much more subtle forms of teaching and of behavioral modification, like demonstration, like teasing, and like task assignment. And I also focused here on the teaching of subsistence skills specifically because these are more readily observable, so it was easier for me to focus my study. And in this study, I considered all individuals, both children and adults living in the camp at the time of data collection, as potential teachers. And then I conducted a social relations model, which is a type of multi-level social network analysis, to see whom amongst this pool of potential teachers actually does the teaching. And here I'll focus just on the results related to age, but in the study I also talked about kinship and gender. So if you want to check out those results, they're already out and published. Okay, so here qualitatively, we found that 75% of teaching directed to children occurred from individuals who were under 18 in both societies. And this was independent of how much time they were in proximity to adults. So as you can see, peer teaching, at least in the domain of subsistence skills, really is the norm. And I want to give you a taste of what this looks like. So here's a boy demonstrating to my colleague Sarah how you set up a trap. So as you can see, like the kids here have set up this small trap and they're play acting the movements of an animal to show her how the trap works. And this really is, in my opinion, BaYaka pedagogy in action. It is teaching, but it's also very playful teaching. And a lot of the teaching looked like this. So looking now at model results, we found a strong quadratic effect of teachers' age. So as you can see, teaching increases until individuals are about 35, after which it decreases. And this increase is really consistent with the fact that as children age, they have more knowledge, so they have more knowledge to impart. And as they age, they have the cognitive abilities required for identifying a knowledge gap and filling it. After about 35, this decline was a bit more of a riddle, but myself and my co-authors interpreted these findings as suggesting that once parents hit their mid-30s and they have multiple children, they also have a lot more work to do, but they also are likely to have other children who can contribute to some of the costs of their siblings' care. So older children may be offsetting some of their own costs by helping their parents, right? By teaching their younger siblings. And also by teaching the younger siblings, they're also ensuring that they don't have to share as much food, right? If folks are feeding themselves, then everybody gets a larger portion of what the parents have to offer. So what we might be seeing here is that by 35 at the family level, we're seeing a division of labor between parents and their children in terms of dividing foraging labor and teaching labor. And we also found a strong interaction between the age of the teacher, the age of the learner, and the society. So here you can see on your right, I believe, the box closer to the pictures, so here you're seeing the red line is a hypothetical 5-year-old learner, and the green line is a hypothetical 15-year-old learner. And then the x-axis here is the age of the teacher. So we're seeing here that 5-year-olds are hypothetically, so in the model, predicted to receive more teaching from younger teachers, whereas older learners are more likely to get teaching from adults. So this is really consistent with the multi-stage learning model, where children gain basic competencies from peers in their younger years, and then they learn more complex skills from adults later on. But as you can see with the Hadza box, the lines are basically identical. That's not happening. So in trying to understand why this was, we interpreted these findings as reflecting different socialization practices between the Hadza and BaYaka. So Hadza children are given from a very young age, as young as 5, fully functioning bows, fully functioning digging sticks, and they're really expected to go out and get their food with those tools. Whereas BaYaka children, even though they are made toys and tools, as you can see in this bottom picture, a little jombi hatchet that a girl's been made, these aren't as functional, these tools, and children really aren't expected and encouraged to use it. So we think that what these findings reflect is the fact that Hadza children are given lots of opportunity to practice with these tools. And so this might offset the need for teaching from adults later on. So we might be seeing this effect of socialization affecting the need for adult teaching later on. So to return to this bioecological perspective, we can see that at a developmental scale, both cognition and skill development likely contribute to children's ability to teach. And at a cultural history scale, socialization practices in early life may shape how much adult teaching children get later on. And then at an evolutionary scale, efficient knowledge transfer of basic skills in the zone of proximal development may limit costs to parents who are busy providing for their growing families. And then finally, for the empirical portion of my talk, I want to tell you about an experimental and naturalistic study of tool innovation that myself and my colleague Sarah Pope Caldwell, who's at the MPI for Evolutionary Anthropology, and I conducted among 4 to 12-year-old BaYaka and their Bandongo farmer neighbors. So we know that tool innovation is at the core of our species' ability to thrive in diverse environments, and experimental studies in the post-industrialized West have found that young children are just not very good at innovating tools. But very few studies have examined whether these low rates of innovation occur outside the West as well. And in many small-scale subsistence societies, children's learning is primarily self-initiated, as we've seen, and children engage in tool use and modification during both work and play. And this is definitely the case in the two communities we worked with here, where children make their own toys, including on the left, a toy car from sticks and discarded flip-flops, as well as play spheres on the right. So in the study, we wanted to see whether these exploratory cultural learning contexts may actually encourage and promote children's innovations. So to test this possibility, we conducted what's called the hook task. So this is a task that was developed for New Caledonian crows and now has been exported across the world, across species, and especially for children. So in this task, children are shown a clear tube, and the experimenter puts a prize, either a sticker, in our case a candy, in a little basket and drops it to the bottom of the tube. And then they're also given two materials, a string, which is the incorrect material, and a pipe cleaner, which is the correct material. But to use the correct material correctly, you also have to modify it, turn it into a hook, and then fish out the prize. And so our issue with the hook task and it being exported to these small scale societies was that even though pipe cleaners are part of early childhood learning experiences in the West, they are a very novel material among BaYaka foragers and Bandongo farmers. So a secondary goal of this analysis was to see if familiarity with the material affected kids' ability to innovate with it. So to look at this, we gave children in one village just hundreds of pipe cleaners. We were just handing out pipe cleaners like candy for them to play with for 2 weeks prior to the experiment. And we just let them incorporate it into their naturalistic play. And we also conducted sampling walks to see what kids were doing with these pipe cleaners. And then in the second village, we did not give children pipe cleaners, and the first time they encountered pipe cleaners was during the experiment. And so what we found, so to give you a little orientation here, so in orange are the kids in our study. The light orange are BaYaka kids, and the dark orange are the Bandongo kids. And then the kids in the middle, so the blue and purple, are two studies that were conducted with Indigenous Australians and with San, and that was restricted to 3 to 5 year olds, so a very narrow age range. And then in green is a study from the United Kingdom. So this will be relevant to subsequent comparison. So we did not find in the study that BaYaka and Bandongo innovation rates were high. In fact, they were as low as they have been in other studies for young children. So we did not find that free play with pipe cleaner improve their performance. We did find, and this was a surprise, that Bandongo farmer children were significantly more likely to innovate a hook during the task. So we think that this may reflect subsistence practices in this community. So Bandongo children frequently go fishing with hook and line. They march up to the store, they buy hooks, they go out, and it's a very common activity, especially for boys to do throughout the day. And it's less so for the BaYaka. So some BaYaka kids will have asked me to buy them fish hooks, but I haven't seen them use it as much. And bail fishing really is the main way in which kids participate in fishing. So this may highlight the fact that tool innovation is not a capacity that's either present or absent, but an emergent ability to integrate relevant information, and variation in prior relevant experience during children's everyday activities may improve children's performance on innovation tasks. Here, I also want to point out that in green, we can see that in the UK, kids' innovation ability really increases with age. So this is the x-axis are different age groups, and there's a very steady increase. And we didn't find that age was a strong predictor for either BaYaka or Bandongo innovation rates. And so what we interpreted this as suggesting is that for the hook task specifically, so not innovation generally, but this very narrow experiment, the thing that these studies in the post-industrialized West are measuring is actually not development, but likely schooling. So if you think of the skills that are gained in school, being face-to-face with an adult, having to solve goal-oriented problems, having to develop certain cognitive skills like a very narrow range of executive functioning makes you really good at solving these tasks. But because BaYaka and Bandongo kids don't have access to the same degree to schooling, and they're spending far fewer hours in school and have much more experience with kind of local and traditional socialization practices, they're just not hitting those same marks that are socialized in school. So this includes so specifically when kids are alone in unfamiliar settings with systematic innovation that's also instrumental, we're not seeing BaYaka and Bandongo kids innovating very much. And if we'd stopped our study here, this would be the end of the story. But of course we didn't, because we conducted naturalistic observations and we found a completely different picture of what children were up to. So children, both BaYaka and Bandongo children, in their free play, combine pipe cleaners into headbands, bracelets, anklets, necklaces, hair accessories, belts, rings, suspenders, and they made all kinds of toys. And as you can see in this figure A, they modified pipe cleaners in a way identical to a hook. So in other words, children's innovations tend to be done in groups, in familiar settings. They tend to be exploratory, and they tend to be social, in our case, aesthetic. And it's important to note that from an evolutionary perspective, both systematic and these unsystematic innovations that are a result of accidents or recombination contribute to the cultural evolution of tools. So to return one final time to this bioecological perspective, we can see that at the developmental scale, we need to be careful to make sure we aren't conflating age with socialization, and specifically a particular exposure to formal education and the culturally specific cognitive and social skills developed in these settings. And then from a cultural history perspective, prior experience may shape children's ability to remember, recognize, synthesize, and generalize relevant experience to innovation tasks. So the hook task is just one shape. And this shape is the only way we've been measuring innovation, or the main way we've been measuring innovation, which in our case, Bandongo children who consistently fish with hooks were much better able to call forward. And then finally, from an evolutionary perspective, childhood may be a period for exploration rather than systematic innovation. And this may be beneficial because it allows children to focus on the process of innovation and by accident find innovations rather than overly narrowing their exploration. And so this may be especially important when the world that children grow up with is different from the world that adults grow up with. And I'm going to talk more about this later on. So to sum up this section of my talk, it's clear that amongst Hadza and BaYaka foragers, evolutionary, cultural, and historical forces act upon development, leading to cross-cultural variation in cultural learning. But I also outlined some striking similarities in how children learn. Specifically, learning occurs with and from peers, through play and peer teaching, and that peer learning can result in the invention of novel objects. And while we tend to view cultural learning as top-down, these findings, I think, compel us to rethink the direction of these arrows and how children's activities and learning independent from adult intervention may contribute to culture change and maintenance over time. So drawing from the literature and many, many sleepless nights recently, especially, I want to focus on this question for the remainder of my talk. So first, here a little bit of background. So children's role in culture change has really been under-examined and under-theorized in cultural evolutionary theory. And I think there's a variety of reasons for this. The first is a very obvious one. All researchers who study children are themselves adults. So we have an adult-oriented view of childhood, with most, if not all, research focusing on children's eventual adulthood. But if you spend any time with children, if you play games with them, and if you listen to their stories, it's clear that the future is only a very small part of their concerns. We also have a Western bias, especially in developmental psychology, where we come from and we study children who grow up in these very unique learning environments where children's activities are really separated from those of adults. Children go to school, adults go to work, though less so now because of COVID, so that things might change in interesting ways. And where we also culturally really view adults as the transmitters of knowledge. We also, of course, have an individualistic bias. So when we do test children, especially again in developmental psychology, we tend to test children individually, or at most we tend to look at dyads of interacting partners. But as we've seen, the group really matters to how children learn and how children innovate together. And then finally, and this is especially true for anthropology, many of us, when we talk about childhood, we actually talk to adults and we ask adults to reflect on their childhood. And in these cases, many times adults will report normative things like my mom taught me, my dad taught me, rather than recalling specific instances in which they learned something. So in these cases, we again tend to get this over-reporting of adults. And especially because so much of peer learning happens in play, they might not think of it as necessarily, you know, it's not as marked as a teaching event as more playful learning. But I don't want to say that children's role in culture change has gone totally unnoticed. So across diverse fields, including economics, sociology, anthropology, social psychology, and linguistics, researchers have noted that children not only can, but that they do contribute to culture change. So my hope is that by bringing these bodies of research into cultural evolutionary theory, we can better understand children's dynamic contributions to processes of culture change. So here I'm going to outline 3 ways I think children contribute to or prevent culture change: through exploration, through the advent and transmission of children's cultures, and as critical adopters of global culture, specifically in relation to market integration into schooling. And because it's the research area, and I know, I'm going to give you supporting examples from the hunter-gatherer literature. So first, to talk about children as explorers. So Alison Gopnik has argued, and rightly so in my opinion, that human life history is shaped by an explore-exploit trade-off. So in early life, children sample their environment through exploration. And while they do this, they test their hypotheses about the world. Then as they age, children's strategies change towards a more exploitative one, focused on explicit goals instead of general environmental sampling. And Gopnik's team has found, for example, that once adults discover a solution to a task, they stick to that one solution. Whereas children, on the other hand, keep sampling the environment, and sometimes there's more than one solution, so they're more likely to discover it. But there have really not been very many naturalistic studies of children's these explore-exploit trade-offs. This is something that myself and my colleague Sarah Pope-Caldwell are currently working on. So here you're looking at GPS data collected over a 6-week period in one BaYaka forest camp. So red are the tracks for adults and blue are the tracks for children and adolescents. And as you can see, children and adults do appear to be traveling in different parts of the forest. And Sarah's actually right now, as we speak, looking at this statistically to see if they explore different parts of the forest. And she's also looking at child and adult variation in terms of what foragers said they were leaving camp to collect and what they actually collected. And these data will help us understand whether children and adults are targeting different resources and how likely they are to deviate from their goals. And I want to add here that ethnographically, I think when you look at things at the community level, this explore-exploit might not actually be as much of a trade-off as we think. I've seen many instances of kids going off to play in the forest, finding a resource, coming back to camp, telling the adults, and the next day the adults make a beeline for honey, for palm nuts, for all kinds of resources. So if we think of it at the group level, children's exploration may actually be bolstering adult exploitation. And this is really consistent with some very recent views on collective cognition and shared cognition and how humans coordinate their cognition throughout their lives. And children's exploration may be an important driver for culture change, especially during instances of community transition. So I really love this study by Camilla Morelli, who's at Bristol, about Matses culture change. So Matses traditionally were hunter-gatherers living in a forest, and they were settled along the banks of a river by the government, where there was a school and easier access to a road and other types of governmental provisioning. Adults, though, continue to make daily trips into the forest to collect forest resources. And while children could accompany their parents, they weren't forced to because of this value of autonomy. So instead, children spent much of their day playing and fishing on the banks of the river. And Morelli argues that in doing so, children developed new subsistence skills like fishing and like paddling, but also through their play, also developed effective relationships to the river. And so in these periods of really sharp culture change, children's activities allow for the exploration of new cultural forms that might drive culture change down the line, specifically an orientation from the forest to the village, to the river and to river-based activities. So even though there's kind of extrinsic forces shaping how these communities are changing, it's the children that are doing the intrinsic community level changes through their activities. So next, I want to talk to you about children as maintainers of cultures, and specifically their own cultures. So children's cultures are the routines, artifacts, values, and concerns that children invent and transmit without intervention from adults. And this includes things like dance crazes. So here's one. So as you can see, these older boys are doing this dance again, performing. They wanted to show my friend Sarah, and this younger boy comes up behind and starts imitating the dance as a way of learning it. So while children's cultures are almost universal, cultural evolutionary researchers haven't paid them much attention. And this is really surprising to me because, as Marin has shown, many aspects of children's cultures are really persistent across many generations of children. And this really challenges the prominent view that vertical transmission from adults to children is more stable than horizontal transmission between children. So it is likely that children's cultures do contribute to individual future benefits. So during their play, their dances, and their activities, children form social bonds that stay with them into adulthood. And these bonds are sources of social and material support, as well as information flow. And as we've seen, children in hunter-gatherer societies also make their own toys, and this may help them learn about tool manufacturing and contribute to their innovative capabilities. And subsistence activities are also part of children's cultures and help them feed themselves on the one hand and practice adult subsistence skills on the other. But I'd like to argue that children's cultures also benefit their communities by developing child-specific technology, generating new ecological knowledge, and retaining abandoned adult knowledge. So in many hunter-gatherer societies, children's cultures extend beyond play to include child-specific subsistence strategies, which are matched to their size, skill, and strength. So a fantastic example comes from Alyssa Crinton's work with the Hadza. Hadza children make a type of sticky trap, which they use to collect weaver birds. And this technology is never used by adults. It's exclusively a children's foraging activity. And children, they do eat these weaver birds, but they don't always. They also play with them. Alyssa has a picture of these children making a necklace out of weaver birds. And she says, it brings new meaning to the term playing with your food. And these child-specific subsistence technologies also contribute to child-specific knowledge about the world. So in this study by Sandrine Gallois and colleagues, the authors demonstrated that BaYaka children's activities can generate new forms of ecological knowledge unknown to adults. Specifically, children and adults differed in their knowledge about mice and birds, which are items considered by adults to be children's hunt. And adults do not consider these forms of hunting to be real hunting. So in this case, it's obvious that ecological knowledge related to children's hunt is transmitted within the playgroup only. And in some cases, there's even evidence that aspects of children's cultures originated in adult culture, even if they're no longer there. So for example, Imamura describes San children playing at spear hunting, even though this technology has now largely been abandoned by San adults. And amongst BaYaka, as in the picture here, children hunt grasshoppers with small bows. And adults, I've never seen BaYaka hunt with bows, and I've seen crossbows. We had one crossbow in the village that was sold off to our research assistant because it wasn't being used. So in both these cases, the transmission of knowledge once belonging to adults is now retained only as part of children's cultures. And these may seem like trivial examples, but here I want to emphasize a few things. The first is that children's cultures are faced with many threats to their transmission, including rapid population replacement as children grow up and leave the playgroup to become adults, adult manipulation of children's time, task assignments, trying to get children to do other things, and external societal and ecological change. So maintaining children's cultures is not passive. Children must innovate new ways of transmitting information for their own cultures to persist. And at larger timescales, I think this probably means that the cultural evolutionary processes that shape children's cultures are distinct from those of adults. I also think that child-specific foraging and associated ecological knowledge and maintenance of cultural traditions has important implications for food security. So all of the foods that children hunt are really the fallback foods for a community. And so it's great for children's play, but when the foods, the kind of high calorie, large items that adults collect, when those are not available, children's foraging may really bolster the community and be a very important part of resilience. And similarly, when holding on to this, to these technologies means that if there is a change and you do need to reinvent a new technology or adjust your technology, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can draw upon these children's cultures and start at this baseline that's a lot higher than if you were starting completely from scratch. So I think that at a community level, children's cultures and the subsistence practices within these may really be part of the cultural resilience of hunter-gatherers. And then finally here, I want to argue that children are critical adopters of global culture, especially as it relates to market integration and schooling. So we know that globalization is not a homogeneous linear process. Sociologists and human geographers have done a tremendous amount of work demonstrating how children mediate the adoption of global culture through processes such as subversive play, resistance, and interpretive reproduction. And I think there's ample evidence to suggest that adolescents especially are open to adopting new cultural forms. So Bonnie Hewlett's work with Aka and Chabu foragers has shown that adolescents travel long distances to seek out new instrumental and cultural technologies, such as basket weaving, hunting techniques, as well as dances. And recently, as part of a bigger study on how adolescents learn to spear hunt, I've been coding hours and hours and hours of video between an adult and an adolescent who've been wearing GoPro cameras and going out to spear hunt. So it's actually the first time I've looked through all this footage, even though I collected it a couple of years ago. And there are two qualitative things that I want to say have really struck me by the conversations I've been monitoring as part of this video footage. The first is that older teachers will routinely tell adolescents in no uncertain terms that guns are farmer technologies and that spears are Yaka technologies. Whereas Yaka teachers, who are themselves just out of adolescence, will bemoan having to hunt with a spear instead of a gun, showing a real change in technological orientation. And second, while nearly all of this spear teaching occurred from adults to adolescents, adolescents routinely explain to adults how they might go about selling meat or other forest items that they came across. So the market integration knowledge was actually flowing from adolescents, to adults. So we're seeing a reversal of flow in terms of how that usually goes. And I'm happy to say that thanks to a grant awarded to my colleague Lee Gatler at Notre Dame, we're going to be investigating these themes further. So we're going to be looking at how BaYaka and Bandongo adolescent orientation to market goods and paid labor in 3 villages that vary in terms of their market integration can help us understand the role of adolescents in culture change. So look out for that research. If we can ever get back to the field, that's our next big task. And then there's, of course, no doubt that schooling also plays a role in culture change, not only because new forms of embodied, cognitive, and instrumental knowledge are acquired in the classroom, but also because time spent in the classroom prevents children from participating in traditional activities, halting or at least altering the transmission of these. And in the West, where school is mandatory, we tend not to wonder what children find important about school attendance. But in many hunter-gatherer societies where attendance is not enforced, or at least not enforceable, children make active decisions about whether or not to attend school. So I've been participating in 2 research projects on hunter-gatherer children's experiences in school. The first is led by myself and Dasha Bomzhakova, looking at BaYaka, comparing school cultures with BaYaka cultures. And then the second is with the hunter-gatherer education and advocacy group, doing one of these broad reviews looking at the literature of hunter-gatherer children's experiences in school. And in both cases, we find that BaYaka children say that they want to attend school to seek out new experiences, learn new things, interact with new people, and have new experiences like try school food. So they're really seeking novelty. But in a lot of cases, when children decide not to go to school, this is because they're voting with their feet in terms of resisting and avoiding lots of discrimination that they face in the classroom, the fact that they are not learning in their mother tongues, the fact that teachers tend to come from a different cultural background from themselves, and because the classroom culture is different. So even though developmental discourse, economic developmental discourse talks about schooling as empowering and not intending schooling or disengaging from school as disempowering, BaYaka really make active decisions about whether or not to attend school based on what they see the benefits and pitfalls of schooling. And then finally, and not just BaYaka, sorry, but also across hunter-gatherer societies, this is the case. And then finally, we know that in Australia, in Canada, in the US, and across the world today, hunter-gatherer children don't always have a choice. In many cases, they've been forced to attend school. And this is part of subtle or not so subtle policies to turn hunter-gatherers into citizens of the state and to govern them in specific ways. But children have these very clever ways of resisting. And I think the best example that I have from this is from Shane Gold. wrote this terrific book about Navajo, and showed that in boarding schools, Navajo children, even though they were punished for doing so, continued to speak the Navajo language in secret amongst themselves. And this led to boarding school Navajo, now called bilingual Navajo. And what they did was that if they didn't have a Navajo word, because they're very young when they go to these boarding schools, so they have incomplete language knowledge, they actually substituted with English, and in doing so, were able to keep their language alive. And the implications of this have a lot to do with cultural identity and also governance. So if we think of at the bigger scale, children's activities at school change how teachers respond to them, how teachers monitor them. So this changes the school classroom. And at larger scales, what children adopt and avoid from school and how they resist school also feeds into how the state governs them and how communities resist state governance and this feedback loop. So these processes might have important implications also for the cultural evolution of these state institutions and state governance. So taken together, the literature I've described and my own ethnographic observations point to the critical role children have as explorers, maintainers, and critical adopters of cultures. And to sum up a talk where I feel like I've gone in a lot of directions, we've outlined evolutionary perspectives of cultural learning, and we've discussed what hunter-gatherers can and cannot tell us about the past. And I've also discussed how hunter-gatherer children learn through play and peer teaching and innovation, and what this might mean for our understanding of culture change from a child's eye view. But there's a lot more work to be done on this topic. So a couple questions that are very pressing to me is how children's role in culture change varies among different societies. So I'm particularly curious about how social values, autonomy, opportunities for meaningful engagement, subsistence, and peer group formation contribute to this variation. And of course, my framework outlines a very micro scale view of culture change. But do these leave a signature? How can we identify these changes in history, archaeology, and politics at larger time scale? And while throughout the talk, I focus on hunter-gatherers, from TikTok dance crazes to school walkouts to climate activism, children and adolescents really are at the forefront of it all. So if I can go ahead and do a bold move and modify something that Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed children can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So that's my kind of last pitch to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sheina.
Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you so much, Sheina. That is what a range you covered in there with both empirical and the whole review. And it's incredibly persuasive that you're opening up a whole, a kind of whole new perspective on evolution, change, culture change, and what is the cutting edge of culture change. And I was thinking about the climate change even before you got there, before to the last slide. I was thinking, my God, yeah, this is the way to go. Children's leadership. Can I ask people any questions they'd like? I'm not going to take first bite here. So anybody who'd like to stick their hand up or just wave and contribute. We're very interesting perspectives there. Anyone? Chris, go for it.
Well, it's just a kind of question between you, Sheina, and Jerome. I'm probably hugely simplifying everything, but Jerome has tended to tell me that among the BaYaka, kind of teaching doesn't happen. I mean, I'm probably distorting his message, but I mean, really stressing very strongly that the kind of breadcrumbs method is used. You kind of, the people who want to learn something just have to keep up picking up cues through being inquisitive, through kind of somehow just a concept like a kilo, for example. Nobody really teaches you it. You gradually find out, and there's all kinds of clues are given to you. Mm-hmm. So I suppose my question is partly to Jerome, but what do you make of all this? And partly you, Sheina. And of course, and obviously all that's connected, isn't it, with the fact that some of the more conservative aspects of culture, cultural identity, are perpetuated in a different way, aren't they? I suppose something among the Hadza like Maitako or Epime is extremely conservative, and so I've always thought that initiation, any male initiation, female initiation, is the critical point at which almost compulsory, perhaps even coercive teaching, for very good reasons, actually does occur and makes sure that cultural identity is preserved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see, Jerome. I see your hand raised? Do you want to take it first?
No, I think, hi Sheina, wonderful talk. Thank you, real tour de force. No, I think it's your prerogative to go.
So I don't see my perspective as being opposed to Jerome's at all. I think a lot of what Jerome describes in the kind of pedagogical, how could I say this? Like the pedagogical layer of Aquila, the pedagogical framework that Aquila provides is really in line with autonomy. So it is breadcrumbs, but those breadcrumbs are very actively done by the community. And then children have to rise to the challenge of accepting it and wanting to learn it, but it needs to be self-motivated. And a lot of that self-motivation is actually peer motivated and overhearing and discussing things amongst themselves, and really, trying to figure out what adults are up to and trying to understand adult culture amongst themselves. And then I totally agree with you. I think most of my focus has been on subsistence skills. So I've really focused on that, but I think for cultural skills, there's completely different dynamics and it is much more top down. And in this, also in terms of skills that are really, really hard to learn. So in the spear hunting study, which I didn't talk about very much, we're not finding hardly any peer teaching. We asked adolescents, who do you want to teach you? And they all nominated adults, even though we didn't tell them to. In our observations of them, it's, all adults transmitting information to the adolescents about what to do. So there is a time in which it makes more sense to be taught by adults, but in these younger ages, and I actually think it might switch though. So the younger ages, the peer learning matters more for the subsistence and the conventional is more top down. But then in adolescence, it might be, these dances and these kind of aesthetic tattoos. We were talking about this with our research group, that there's these kind of generations of different body modifications that seem to be just only in certain subsets. And part of that is initiation, but part of that is also just fashion. And so that might be adolescents doing more conventional skills. But when it comes especially to rituals, I completely agree that it tends to be a lot more top down. Jerome, anything?
Yeah. Hi, sorry. I'm cooking, which is what this time. But look, I think, what we're talking about here are quite different sort of skill levels or types of skills. So what Sheina has really beautifully demonstrated is how young people learn subsistence skills and the sort of generic subsistence skills that it's sometimes said that, by around the age of 12 or 13, most of these forager kids can actually feed themselves if they have to. And this is how they acquire that level of knowledge, and the confidence to do so is very much how Sheina has discussed. But what we're talking, work like the stuff I did on Aquila was really this problem of trying to understand how values are transmitted. And of course, the skills are vital for subsistence, but then also in terms of cultural continuity, and this is the Ron Brunton criticism of egalitarian societies, that they're just this random assemblage with no sort of real, it's just fortuitous, whatever gets handed down and what doesn't. And so really the angle that I took in trying to explain how people learn things really did try and focus on these much more ephemeral, less obvious aspects of cultural transmission. And what I thought was very interesting in Sheina's talk, so I'm not sure if I've fully answered, Chris, but was this observation that among BaYaka around the age of 35, adults seem to do less instructional or less teaching around subsistence. And I think this does return to something that Chris mentioned, which is the role of initiation. And, that actually, I mean, if you spend time in these gendered spaces that initiates go to. And in the BaYaka case, you know, around 7, it depends on the sort of maturity of the kid, but around 7, 8, 9, these kids will be getting initiated into these adult cults. And of course, in the initial moments, they'll be very childish about it. They won't be paying attention. But as they get a bit older and, you know, other things are happening in their lives, they start to attend to much more subtle teachings. And these are to do with, you know, mystical practices in the women's cults, to do with sexuality, proper behavior in sexual relationships, issues around procreation, childbirth, complications with, menstruation or whatever it might be. But also in Yele and things like that, you have very sophisticated hunting, the closest, I mean, in terms of sort of generic anthropological categories, but I don't think this captures it, a sort of shamanism where they're traveling out over the forest and their spirits are seeking out the spirits of game animals to tie them up for the men to go and hunt later. So you have a whole range of other skills which you know, broadly speaking, could be interpreted as subsistence skills, but actually incorporate all sorts of cosmovision elements, understandings of myth and history in ways that BaYaka do. And then you've also got the sort of advanced foraging skills, particularly in men's secret spaces. And we, you know, when we're on those spaces, men deliberately say, look, we only share this stuff here because we don't want the women to know. We want women to come to us for meat. And if we tell the women how we kill elephants or catch buffalo or you know, there's a whole bunch of tricks for catching pigs and crocodiles and all sorts of other things, you know, then maybe they wouldn't come to us for meat, and that would be terrible. So we've got to make sure they keep coming back for meat, and that's why we only share this stuff in these secret spaces between men. So you know, I think that you know, there's nothing contradictory at all in what Sheina has been presenting. It's just that there is a really rich range of different cultural elements that people need to transmit, and they do so in very different ways. Perhaps the question of didactic teaching is something that, or instructional teaching. You know, of course, occasionally these things do occur, but you know, it's only when there's some sort of real claim to different status, in the sense that a mother will be fairly confident she knows better than her daughter or son who's 7 or 8 and is misbehaving or doing something. And so we'll say to him, look, come on, stop doing that. But he may or may not do or stop doing it or continue doing it. And actually, it's very rare for adults who make those kinds of comments to ever expect the child or respond to whether the child does or doesn't do the thing they've requested.
Yeah. We've quantified this, Jerome, and we found exactly what you're saying. So we found that their children receive lots of requests as they grow up, and they comply with them more as they grow up, but they receive no repercussions. And the only time we've seen adults tell each other off in their parenting is when a parent was trying to make a child do something the child didn't want to do. And then the parent will say, leave them alone, let them go with you, or don't make them go with you, or whatever. And we've even seen parents say, like, well, are you going to feed them? And then just leave their kid behind to be fed by other people because the child didn't want to go out foraging or do something. So we have a paper in ethos on this topic on learning autonomy, and we looked at this quantitatively and also with a lot of ethnographic examples.
Brilliant.
Describing exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Excellent. The one time I did see a mother really getting angry with her son for not going hunting with her husband or his father. She was reprimanded viciously by everybody else for getting so angry with the kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, lovely stuff, Sheina. Really, yeah, I think I've ended up. Yeah, go on. I should let other people ask questions.
His dinner. So, Yanis, you had your hand up. Yanis?
Yeah. Hi. Firstly, thanks, Sheina. Your work is so amazing. And this is coming from a student of anthropology who herself specializes in, anthropology of childhood. So I definitely had a lot of takeaway points from your entire range of work that you've done. My question to you would be from more of a reflexive point, where I'd like to ask you, when you were out there in the field as a researcher, if not an ethnographer, how do you position yourself when your participants or respondents are actually children? And I seek an answer to it because, even in children's studies and research on children, we have come a far way from treating children as subjects to treating children as active social actors who are, who pretty much have their own agency, and they are they're not merely objects of inquiry for researchers anymore. I mean, talking about from a very recent trend in children's studies. So where do you position yourself when you were out there as an outsider, as a foreigner, dealing with children from a altogether different world?
Yeah, so I was positioned by the community in the realm of children very early on. So I think part of that is because I tend to get on the ground and play with children in a childlike way. That's just my personality. I was a preschool teacher for a year. I have a certain child stance. And also the way that I came about learning the language was by talking to children and just being on the periphery of adult conversation and trying to get the sounds. And children are always on the edge. And then children just wanted to hang out with me. They were curious about my stuff because it's new stuff. They wanted to touch my phone. They wanted to hang out with me. And so I just kind of got incorporated within the play group in that way. And then I also, of course, I'm not a child because I was an adult. So I think I ended up kind of being put into the no kids, so she must be an adolescent kind of range, especially as my linguistic skills got better, and as my ability to walk in the forest without falling over got a little bit better. As the more seasons I went back, then people would ask me, and I was expected to do some more things for myself, and then I would go out with the children to do that, like get water or help collect some food or some firewood and stuff like that. But I really took my lead from the children, and I think I totally acknowledge that my original research and what I started out doing, especially with these structured observations, was very much my own coding. I came in with ideas of what I wanted to study, and it wasn't co-created. But I think now, especially with this kind of new research agenda I'm setting out for myself, I think my next step is to have the kids do their own research and to think about these things from a kid's point of view and think about the world, have them tell me about what they want to study and what they want me to do. And I think they've really participated in our research, like very actively. They have been our kind of mini research assistants, following us around. Also, when we've done other research, like we've collected saliva samples and kids were following us, helping us translate and doing stuff. So they've really gotten to know us and our research agenda. So I think the next step is now trying to figure out their research agenda. And there are some kids who didn't like me as much and other kids who really liked me a lot. And it just depended on who I had spent more time with and certain families that I was close to. So there's, of course, going to be variation in just how comfortable the kids are around me. So that's, of course, another thing that I don't have as much control over. But as I kind of flip between more qualitative and more quantitative research, I have more opportunities to play with those two aspects a little bit. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat which kind of follows a little bit about what Sheina's saying. Jocelyn, do you want to talk about that? Do you want to ask that? On technology? Or maybe you can't speak.
But I'm happy to answer, Jocelyn, and then you can. Yeah.
The mic thing up.
Yeah.
Okay, just let people know the question.
Yeah, so is technology coming into hunter-gatherer societies, for example, phones or GPS devices for mapping? How do children and or adults respond to this? Yes, so in our experience in this kind of village where there's no road, so it's not very well integrated into the market town. There are things, people do have radios and SD cards. Those are gifts that are given to them usually by farmers or that they buy with like labor that they do. I find these things to break very quickly, so they don't seem to last very long within the community. I bought a friend a wind-up radio and it was broken in 2 days. But what I've noticed is that both the adults and the kids are really, really good at familiarizing themselves with new technology. And I once handed my phone to a kid who within 1 minute figured out where the camera was and then was running around taking pictures. So obviously these devices are really well made to be user friendly, and these children are really well made to explore this technology and figure out how to use it. And I suspect that we're going to be seeing more of that as communities become more market integrated, and that might change. But I think Jerome's work about, especially in terms of how much money goes into Masana spirit dances, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of these goods really being reintegrated into the kind of forest spirit economy rather than just sticking around within individuals. So things still tend to be kind of redistributed and given away pretty quickly. And with GPS, I haven't seen this as much, but I suspect that any BaYaka who work for logging companies will be more familiar with that technology. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I wanted to put in something asking about the differences with the Hadza a little bit more, particularly those teaching curves that were so flat with the Hadza and then shifted for age of teacher significantly more for BaYaka. What underlying reasons for that in your view? I read a little bit about what you were saying there, but can you say any more about it?
Absolutely. I think there's actually a lot going on, and some of it because I never quite got Hadza in the couple months I was there, it's harder for me to access what our parents are thinking about. But in my conversations with Alyssa and then in my own conversations with BaYaka parents, I think BaYaka parents really view their role as parents at taking children into the forest and, giving children opportunities to interact with the forest in these really directed ways. And I think Hadza don't view that as much. So I saw so many instances of BaYaka parents being like, come into the forest with me, come into the forest with me. And then the kids would be like, oh, I don't feel like it. I never saw that as much with Hadza. And I think Hadza parents really expect kids to go out amongst themselves. Right. But I think the way in which Hadza parents teach is by making these objects for children, and also siblings do it. So not just parents, but these small, very functional objects really forces children to engage with this technology. And so I think what it might be is that Hadza children are, if you just look at raw learning, like they're spending more time doing it, but it's more just out in the playgroup, low cost. Whereas BaYaka children, when they're foraging, they're like playing, they're hanging out with their friends. And then at one point they're like, okay, I'm out with my dad and my dad is teaching me how to make fire and climb trees and collect honey and do all these very like directed things. Right. And then that's like a moment, and that's what they remember. And that's what BaYaka adults tell me. Whereas for Hadza, it's like, go play with your friend, like go do your work, go collect the figs. We need figs. Yeah. So it's just a different approach.
Fundamentally ecology driven then to some extent.
I think that might be part of it. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about, so obviously the early comparative research was San and Hadza. And then I've been thinking about BaYaka as like the third. And I think it's kind of maybe a U shape where Hadza, it's like the ecology is difficult enough that everybody's got to pull their weight, but straightforward enough that children can participate. And then San, it was just like too hard on both scales. And BaYaka, there's just so rich, you kids can go and play and adults can collect, head of palm nuts in an hour. And
so abundance. So abundance is underlying.
Yeah. So I think it would be interesting. I have some foraging returns data now from BaYaka that I'm working on. So I'll let you know. I'll let you know soon what I find. Yeah.
Great. Jerome, did you want to come back again?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Good.
No, well, just, I mean, one of the things that's, I'd be curious, there are a couple of questions I'd like to ask Sheina. One is the extent to which the engagement in musical culture among the BaYaka may affect that curve around the age of 35. Because, you know, I mean, when you look at these performances, Masana and Mokondi Masana and so on, it's a dance and music, and that's what people often think about. But as I was just mentioning, there's this whole backside to it on these secret paths where there's all sorts of what Ningome, these knowledge areas of secret knowledge. And so I don't know to what extent, perhaps it's the difference where Hadza ritual life is more elemental. It hasn't got, you know, this extraordinary variety and range that BaYaka and Baka people have. I mean, just for people who don't know, I mean, the area where I work, there was more than 23 different types of ritual performance, each with its own set of songs, rules, and so on. There are Baka groups that have been studied along the Mulundu Road with 50 plus performance styles in their group. So this, I mean, this is a really rich culture. It's not, so I just wondered if that was something that might account for those things. Then the other thing I'd really be interested to hear you explain more about, Sheina, is the gradations within childhood. So, I mean, you've talked about childhood in a very sort of big way, but of course, you know, you have toddlers, then we have what we might, you know, reasonably call children, you know, small children, but then you get sort of as puberty emerges, you know, around sort of 11, 12. And one of the discussions I had that was very interesting with, her name slips my mind, an archaeologist who worked with the San, was that Alison Brooks, yeah. Was that among the San, because fats are very rare in their diet, girls tend to arrive at puberty much later than they do in the West. But by contrast, among BaYaka, and perhaps I thought it was to do with, you know, pigs being a very common food and palm nuts being readily available, young girls tend to enter puberty, I mean, in my guesstimate experience, around 13, 14, 15, and some girls by the age of 16, 17 are already starting families. So I just wondered, you know, how you calibrate those sorts of differences into your understanding of what is children and how that affects the comparisons that you're making. And then there was one final little point, which is probably a throwaway point, which is just about Olivier Morin, who did this wonderful work on nursery rhymes and children's playground games based on analyzing paintings, and you know, saw like hundreds of years of continuity of transmission horizontally. But anyway, that was just in Western.
Yeah, so he cited in the talk, I mean, I mentioned him briefly, but his work is incredible, and it's mostly published in French, so I think it hasn't kind of bridged the cultural evolution. There's a real linguistic divide between French and English cultural evolution, and
okay,
he's been squarely on one. But I find his research to be super cool, and I think there would be, because there's so much diversity amongst BaYaka, looking at what songs and games really are across all the communities versus what localized ones are kind of blimps and then they are trends, then they disappear, would be really cool, because I think there's a regional perspective that you can't often get with other foragers. So we should talk about that more another time. So in terms of music, yeah, I am not a great singer, so I have not been incorporated into music culture all that much. So it's harder for me to talk about. I will also say that the family I've spent the most of my time with are probably pretty strange in this way, in that they don't seem to do, it's not like a nightly occurrence like it was where Dasha worked, you know, just one neighborhood away. And also I haven't seen as much Moajo. I haven't seen a lot of the things that you guys talk about. We just haven't seen as much of it. And I think it's just the Mokonji of our place is just not not his skill set. He's not what he's interested in. So I think I have a maybe more of a biased view in terms of those things. But I think it's probably the case that maybe what's happening is that after that 35 mark, which is obviously a very general mark, there are either the adults are initiating their kids in other things. So they're doing more nighttime stuff. They're doing more specialized stuff, or themselves. And we really don't know very much about adult to adult transmission. And yet we know I became a parent a year and a half ago, and I'm scouring the internet constantly, seeking for other parents who share in my pain or my joys. And I think there's so much horizontal transmission happening in adulthood. We know from Unger's work that food taboos are mostly horizontal in adulthood. And I think knowledge about parenting and knowledge about these other things that you would only encounter in adulthood are probably happening during that time. So I think it's probably music, and these musical cultures are very much part of it, but there's not as much on it. 100, yes, by outside. I'll come back to this in a sec, Jocelyn. Okay, so that was does that address the first question?
Yes.
Okay, which is, I don't know, I trust you. I read your work, and that's what I pull from that. In terms of the age gradation, I think that's a really interesting question. So in my experience, the adolescents really are in this liminal space where they can sometimes play with the kids and sometimes they choose to be with adults. And I watched in one occasion this adolescent girl who's an incredible forager. She's so efficient. And she just decided to stick around in camp and play huts with the girls and just like have a good time. And her uncle was like, "You're a woman, like, what are you doing?" And she just left the camp and went back to her mom, who was in the village. So I think that there's a lot going on there, and I haven't had as much time to delve into these social relationships as much, but I think these kids are really playing the bridge between adults and other kids. And I think these toddlers are also doing the same thing between the baby world and, the middle childhood world. And there's so many instances where a toddler will just beg to go with their, 10-year-old sibling who's just going to play in the periphery. And there's like a war of, okay, who's going to be in charge and that type of thing. So yeah, I think in terms of age groups, this is again something I'm hoping to look at in these data that I collected on children's foraging that Sarah is looking at, and that I'm also planning on looking at in terms of group composition, thinking about what kids are collecting and how much they're collecting based off who they're with. And so we have these dense networks where we've asked every individual leaving camp, like, who are you going with? What are you collecting? And, sometimes they're doing multiple trips a day. So we have 6 weeks of these data with GPS and actographs and weighing food. And we're hoping to look at these things a bit more, including looking at play and how much activity goes into play. And so it would be, your question makes me wonder about also the energy expenditure of play and the age at which kids are playing with different kids. I love the adolescent boys are like they're my best friends. So they hang out at my house and they show me their music and tell me about their lives and teach me BaYaka swear words. And from them, I know that so much of adolescent boys' lives is just like roaming around the village, like hanging out with different people, listening to gossip, transmitting gossip back. And also it's a time in which I've noticed that they spend a lot of time with the farmers as well. And it's where there might be pseudo friendships or tense friendships. That's the time at which that's created. And and a lot of it, Ingrid just wrote personal autonomy is paramount in a direct message. Sorry, Ingrid, to call you out. But yeah, I mean, in all cases, I think a lot of the times I've seen kids really decide who they want to hang out with. And just to say one thing about adulthood here, just because it brought it to mind. So there was a moment in camp where all the kind of boys decided they were going to make these little slingshots out of rubber, and they were out hunting birds with these slingshots. And then all the adult men decided they were going to do it too. And they would go out on these hunting expeditions with the boys. And so I would ask the boys, is this work or is this play? Like, oh, it's play. Like this is, and then when I would ask the men, they're like, this is very serious work. So even though they were out doing the same thing, collecting the same songbirds. So that gradation happens for men too. And the adolescents kind of pull men into this play as well. And I think for the women, the songs and the Montika games that are played at night, adolescent girls are really the drivers of that too. So I think a lot of cultural playfulness comes from these adolescents. I don't know, it's not a great answer, but it's one I think it's a really good question. And I think it's one worth looking at a little bit more.
Yeah, we maybe need a special study on adolescence,
yeah.
and culture change on that
yeah.
one.
It's forthcoming.
There's a couple of one question from Edward is about gender, and he says he can't speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about very early stages of child development. Boys and girls, are they playing very similarly? When do gender differences really start to become significant? Don't young boys imitate mothers, grandmothers, sisters and play with dolls?
Yeah, so they do. And the question isn't do they, but how different is it? And I think the question of age is a really good one. We found in our research that most of the gender differences happen in adolescence. So for example, in terms of rough and tumble play, the only gender difference we found in rough and tumble play was in adolescence. So at those times where you're maybe showing off a little bit more, or you're trying to bond with your buddies a bit more, that again tends to be in adolescence when that's happening. Young boys do imitate their mothers and grandmothers, but Pat Draper really put forward a theory of identification and brought it into the hunter-gatherer literature that even in cases where there's no kind of power, disempower of being one gender or another, children tend to identify with individuals of their own gender, and then they tend to emulate that behavior more. And that in developmental research, we know that starts around 2. Kids start to develop their gender identity around 3. And then very quickly after that, they really focus on what they see kids like them doing. And that's especially true if things are gender marked. So if you tell a child like pink is for girls and blue is for boys, then in those cases, they tend to conform. But if it's just like all children play with pink and blue, then in those cases they tend not to conform. So it just also depends on what categories are marked and what's culturally the convention is. This is men's work or this is women's work. But yes, children do flip-flop across the board, and it's just a question of what they do more or less of. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Edward. I see Jocelyn also has a question here. Are there studies on hunter-gatherer societies that are being influenced more by the outside world, whether through road building, kids going to school, adults being employed, how this affects learning in children and them losing their understanding of their culture, ecology of their forest, and hunting and gathering? Yeah, there are a bunch of studies on this, some of which I've cited here. Camilla Morelli's study is a good one. The Sandrine Gallois study talks about their BaYaka's increased interaction with Nzime farmers. That's another good one. And then Noah Lavi's incredible work with Nayaka in schooling culture change is another one to look at. She has a forthcoming paper in hunter-gatherer research and a paper just out in Anthropology and Education Quarterly. And those are the kind of highlights I would give, but I'm sure there's a lot more out there that I haven't mentioned.
Can I come back to gender, Sheina? Because you've got a very interesting article, what Rachel Reckon was the lead author in the Social Inequalities paper. And it's this theory of that, how much gender relation and gender hierarchy may be affected by factors like settlement, and obviously could potentially be affected greatly by issues of school as well. But maybe say a little bit more about what the findings were there in terms of the shift in the membership of playgroups and how they operated.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that paper, in that book chapter, we wanted to center children as agents of change, so on brand. So we argued 2 ways in which children might be agents of change in hunter-gatherer societies before agriculture. So when hunter-gatherers become delayed return hunter-gatherers. And the 2 pathways we drew out, I'll start with the play one first. So in many hunter-gatherer societies, because camps are so small, there's not a lot of opportunities to segregate by age. So children are really forced to play with kids who are older than younger than them. And so in these cases, it's not that fun to play like a competitive game of soccer when your age range is 3 to 16. So kids tend to play non-competitive games that are usually either cooperative or you're competing against yourself. So what we argued in the paper is that as you settle, and especially your population grows, you have access to more same-age playmates, more opportunities to play competitive games. And so this ethos of competition might grow up with you. As you grow up, that might follow you into adulthood, which would lead to inequality in adulthood because you've grown up with that ethos of competition. So this is really in line with some of Piaget's work on play and morality and the kind of morals and egalitarianism that you learn during play and the ways in which you learn hierarchy during play and who's good at this and who's bad at that. So that was one strand of our argument. And the second strand of our argument is really, again, drawing on Pat Draper's work, that girls tend to be in closer proximity to adults. So when you don't have a lot of work around, and in a hunter-gatherer camp, you work less than in a farmer camp, there's not as much trying to get children to do labor. But when you settle, there is so much more labor to do. And so because girls are in proximity to adults more, they tend to be directed to do more work. And also because girls' work tends to be in closer proximity to adults, whereas boys tend to be sent further away. There's more social control of girls. And so over historical time, as you would have this happen generation after generation, girls would kind of have fewer opportunities to assert their autonomy. I think it's been a while since we wrote that paper in 2017, but that's the gist of the argument. So these opportunities for work shape the types of gender relationships, and also fewer opportunities for boys and girls to play together, which again, the mixed gender play group is so part of a hunter-gatherer life way that you have to have mutual respect because you're friends, you know, but as your play group becomes gender segregated, you have fewer interactions. So that was the kind of gist of our argument. The more work you have, the more gender differences you get in your community, just as a byproduct of these interaction opportunities, both children and adults and children and children. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Of course.
Interesting. Were there any more questions? Jocelyn was asking, well, there was a question. Oh, Dasha. I don't know. There's some questions about climate crisis, consciousness, activism, and questions about homosexuality. I don't know if you'd like to just choose what you'd like to go.
Yeah, I'll start with Tam. Yeah, it's a good question. I think BaYaka are experiencing so much change in terms of the forest just being cut down that climate crisis, I mean, there's like direct things that they're observing. And I think Jerome has more to say about this, but I am really curious to know how kids are thinking about this. But I have been focusing on how kids are conceiving of the world and how these changes are affecting how they explore, how they play. But I would be really interested to pursue these questions further. So it's a good question. Stay tuned for future thing. I don't know, Jerome, have you noticed any BaYaka child activists alongside Greta Thunberg and those youths?
No, I haven't. It doesn't mean that they won't emerge, but I mean, the situation in Congo, you know, it's a very well, it's a dictatorship since 40 years. You don't voice your opinions freely without fearing consequences. And BaYaka, without any political allies in capitals or local centers of power, are extremely vulnerable to the mores of more powerful people and can experience extreme violence sometimes from such people. So they tend to be very cautious about protesting. They certainly do comment on the effects of essentially extractive capitalism on their forest, and they are very keenly aware of the consequences of that. It's not so much children having those discussions as adolescents and elders, but there is a very strong critique of the ways that outsiders are coming into the forest, not respecting proper sharing, and just extracting all they want without thought for the species, and doing it in some sort of moderation. And that this is causing hunger, it's causing scarcity, it's causing things to be more difficult to find. The exact reasoning people give will vary from individual to individual. So some people say it's the noise of too much shooting that's scaring all the animals away. Other people say, oh, it's because they're killing too many animals. And anyway, so it's quite a varied situation. There isn't a sort of systematic basis for these judgments. It's really people's experiences, and they articulate those in different ways.
But Darsha Narvez, hi Darsha, says Indigenous youth are part of the Earth Guardians, www.earthguardians.org. So it seems like in other places, Indigenous youth are at the forefront, and we know that they're at the forefront of the climate crisis.
But I know a number of these people, and they all have been through schools. They've all been, very acculturated to Western styles of presentation and so on. It's a different scene.
That's the other thing with these youth movements, is each one is building upon, there's like an inspiration one from the other. And so BaYaka, who tend not to be on these social media or as clued into these to TikTok and stuff like that, at least in the village where I work, they don't have internet or any kind of cell phone reception. They might not even be aware that these things are happening. I bet if they were, they would be into it.
They'd liven up the protests enormously.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, we need them. Jocelyn had a question there about homosexuality, but not sure if you want to take that on.
I don't know much about that, so it's hard for me to speak to.
It's difficult to have real data there.
Yeah.
Well,
Jerome, say something.
Right.
Well, yeah, just that, we link sexual orientation to identity in a way that is not common in my experience among BaYaka people. So the idea of same-sex experimentation or pleasuring or enjoyment is something that's entirely normal, and people don't make a fuss. And I've seen girls pleasuring one another and the boys just being chased away, told to bugger off and go and do something else, and girls not embarrassed at all. I was much more embarrassed than they were. And I've heard boys discussing mutual pleasuring sessions in a very natural and uninhibited way. So I think that, because I think of heterosexual normativity being imposed so fiercely in various religious traditions that we're familiar with, it makes those kinds of behaviors being so counter the mainstream ideology. Well, it's no longer mainstream, thank goodness, but it sort of highlights them. And in these societies where you don't have that rule making and dogmatic insistence on these things, people are much freer. But the basic context of your life is that if you don't have children to care for you as an old person, you're going to suffer. And so the idea that you wouldn't have a family, regardless of whatever sexual practices you enjoy, is sort of unlikely. You really do want to have children, not just for the joy they bring as liveners of life, but also because they will help you when you're older. And childless couples are often loaned or given, shared children. They adopt children, and those children become very close to them and become very important allies in their later life.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Jerome.
Just add to that, or not add anything, but just maybe just comment on it. Is that to the extent that you really do have allocare and you do have a kinship system which is classificatory, and it is actually quite difficult to be childless, isn't it? Because your children aren't just your biological children. Your sister's children are your children, and so some of the questions we find over here is, what about somebody who's childless or infertile? In a certain sense, if it's a genuinely egalitarian hunter-gatherer society where everything's shared, you share your children as well. So it's quite difficult to be childless in quite the Western sense that we picture.
Yeah, the people don't understand it. I mean, now Sheina's had a baby, they'll understand you, and they'll think, oh, she's a real person.
Yeah.
But
I've already gotten messages to that effect. So yeah.
Great.
There's a question here from Edward. In the West, we have many models of child development, which inform our parenting, schooling, Piaget, Vygotsky, Montessori, Steiner, etc. How do hunter-gatherers, adults conceive of how children change over time? Is there such a thing as parenting as we conceive of it? So in our review paper from 2017 or 2018, we reviewed some of this literature about hunter-gatherer views of personhood. And the kind of general sense that we got from the literature are two things. The first is that hunter-gatherer parents tend to view child development as something that happens autonomously. So children are born who they are, and you just have to give it time for them to become that person. And so you can guide, but you can't really shape. The second thing that we noticed is that hunter-gatherers across the world tend to have, so we tend to have a very instrumental view of development, like what can you do? Can you write? Can you addition? Can you put this block in this other block? For many hunter-gatherers, it tends to be more of a social cognition. So Noah talks about booty. Amongst the BaYaka, it's mayele. There's rama or amongst the Walpiri. Across the world, there's different terms for this, but it's gaining sense. So as you grow up, you gain a sense of the world. You act cooperatively. So one instance I saw, this man was lighting up a cigarette and the fire was out. And before he even had the chance to ask somebody, a 10-year-old boy showed up with a little stick that had an ember on it and this guy was like, oh, what a smart boy, like mayele, real mayele. And so this ability to preempt what is needed for the community and to provide it, that really seems to be the yardstick that many hunter-gatherer communities view. And so things like anger, thinking about Jean Briggs' research, those are things that you're just underdeveloped. And so it just takes time, you'll grow out of it, you'll become social. And it's just a question of time of being within the community. And that's why there's a lot of studies, a lot of early studies were about interpersonal aggression between children. And they've mostly found that hunter-gatherer parents don't reprimand or punish, they just separate. And the idea being like, they'll just grow out of it when they're ready to be pro-social, when they're ready to cooperate, they'll be there, they're just not there yet. So I hope that answers your question, Edward.
Thanks. That's great. And Tam, do you want to say something, Tam? Because obviously a lot of what you're saying throws a great deal of doubt upon the methods of Western schooling to a large degree. It's as if Western schooling is deliberate top-down control with very little benefit necessarily. You want to say anything?
Well, yeah, I know. I mean, all we've ever had is like David Bowie's song Cooks, right, about when he had his baby, that if you don't want to do the homework, we'll throw it on the fire and take the car downtown. We clung on to that. That was all there was. But, I do see and gain hope from the way my daughter operates, and it's just so natural to her to be operating with much younger kids and sort of, I mean, it happened in a cafe today. There's a little one, she was 5, and she just came and sat on Morgan's knee, and just her ease with her patience, her ability to communicate at a level that she would enjoy was just so fantastic to watch. And I just wish they had more opportunity to do that at school even. It's wonderful to watch it in the play park. And but I do see that sort of, now that she's about to go to secondary, it'll probably get more difficult, but then she'll become a childminder probably, and just start making money from that, possibly even. So it is wonderful, but I am sort of hugely inspired. It was wonderful talk, Sheina. Thanks so much. I mean, so much of it was to begin with over my head completely, but I got a lot of gist from it, and especially because I'm looking at the moment in terms of dealing with a sort of angle about political Communist Party program, and they've just been revising their women's questions section, and I've said to them, why don't you have a children's section? And because I was hugely inspired by on COP26, I was part of a march with kids taking the day off from school and strike. And that morning, I just remembered, I've got a megaphone. I should take that with me. And they absolutely loved it and insisted that I lead a chant with them all doing the response for 4 hours. And I was absolutely knackered by the end of it. Yeah. But it was truly wonderful. I can see that these young ones, and these are 11-year-olds I'm talking about, they have to be given their place politically as well. And that I've just then thought with that this draft program needs to be converted into a form in which their views are taken. So I'm sort of setting myself that task now as well. But it's wonderful how all of these things are sort of coming together. I do find for me. And so yeah, thanks so much for that.
Thank you. That's great. It's great. I love the idea of a children's section. What an important part of a
yeah.
Well, I think we're learning that the children are the leadership, actually, or they should be given credit as the leadership, and the planet is going to depend on it. So do that.
Yeah. I missed the quote right at the end, but I got her name, Margaret Mead. But
it's the classic Margaret Mead quote, but we just crossed out citizen and wrote children.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Always find that quote.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I mean, I think that's a really important point you made, Sheina, and also Tam, of course. And one thing that has always struck me when I've been in BaYaka camps is the role of sort of 9, 10, 11-year-old girls in just kicking off song and dance and masana performances, these ritual performances, and they really are like the motor that sort of keeps the whole sort of spirit going in the camp of just motivation to do this. And they really do sing all night long. It's incredible. And they're very quick to sense the atmosphere in camp and decide, yes, now we need to do this particular ritual. And as you know from some of my work where I've been arguing that these musical performances are actually sort of government in a sense. It's how you learn what is proper behavior. And so thinking about that in terms of the politics of young girls, I think there's a whole missed trick that we have in the West in not really appreciating the extraordinary power that this age group has to really influence society, actually. And it reminds me of something, and I've really got to look this up again, but I remember reading Colin Turnbull, and there was a crisis in camp. It was a really serious crisis. I think someone had tried to kill somebody else or something really heavy. And the camp decided that, look, when it's this important, we can't decide it, us adults. And it was the adolescent children who had to come in and judge the situation and make the decisions about what would be the appropriate behavior and response to this action. And I think that if we were to empower our adolescents much more with that kind of responsibility, we would actually transform the way they see themselves and what they can contribute. Anyway, just on that children change the world, I think is a very important point that we really haven't appreciated. So thank you, Sheina, for that. And
fantastic. Oh, Dasha, do you want to pop in? I'm going to make this the last question because I think Sheina needs to
Hi, Darsha.
Hello, thank you so much. Very interesting. Loved it. Just a comment in reaction to what Jerome just suggested. There is a lot of research in political science and adolescence and child moral reasoning kind of stuff. And they find that at least in the Western weird populations, adolescents are harsher in their judgments. They want to punish people, for minor infractions. So there might be something different about, of course, our natural way of raising kids that evolved, what we call the evolved nest. compared to the civilization's kind of hierarchical, competitive, same age group stuff, that
But
has
Darsha,
an
can I just
impact on
ask
that.
you, is that mostly an experimental task that those findings are found, that in middle childhood they are harsher punishers?
Probably is.
Yeah, because I just think the experimental tasks really amplify these extremes. And then in real life, when you talk to kids or when they're kind of considering the complexity of real life, my guess is that those would be attenuated. So I've been following some of this work on this cross-cultural work on equity and how children are paying attention, how they punish people who don't conform or who deviate or who hoard, or, you know, all these experimental tasks. And I've just been curious what this would look like in non-experimental contexts when children are negotiating the complexities of the real world.
Yeah, I think the experimental hypotheticals, you know, it's a whole different thing, but that's what psychology tends to study, right? The undergrad in the lab, and then generalizes to all humanity, right? Which is kind of nuts. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think we've got to say thank you to Sheina. What a beautiful talk, and you've just taken us to so many places with that, the comparatively and just thinking so broadly. So yeah, wonderful to have that. We will have to have you back again when we got more results, as soon as you get a chance to get back to the field.
Absolutely.
I'm really pleased to know that you'll be coming to Durham for next year as well, because that'll have we'll have you more accessible, hopefully live another time. Just to say to everybody, we have a Christmas fairy tale next week, which is always a tradition, a long rag tradition. So we've got one more go next week on Tuesday. It's on Zoom. But listening, it's always a lovely experience, and Chris will be handling that. We might get Robin to read the fairy tale, and Chris will be telling us about it, and then we'll have lots of discussion. But thank you so much, Sheina, and
thank you all for having me.
Have a wonderful Christmas, Happy New Year, and see you again. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.